Hi, this is National Master Dan Heisman, and we're here with another video to help you improve your chess game. And today I thought we'd talk a little bit about candidate moves. One of the ideas that I've talked about over the years is what I call initial and final candidate moves. Well, first of all, what's a candidate move? A candidate move is a move that you're considering, a move that you're going to analyze to see if you're going to play. But another definition of a candidate move is it's a move that does something. What do I mean by it does something? Well, there's generally four different types of things that your move can do. It could either initiate initiate a tactic. It could stop a tactic. It could try to make your pieces better, or it could try to restrict your opponent's ideas or pieces in some way. Those are the four main things that a candidate move would do. So in order for a candidate move to exist, it has to do something. Occasionally I'll have a student play a game and he makes a move and I'll say something like, I don't get that move. Why is that a candidate move? I'm not trying to criticize the fact that I don't like the move. I'm trying to get them to explain what is it that they thought that move did that was something positive for them or negative for their opponent that made them think that it was worth considering that move. Because a lot of times they play moves where I don't see what that move does. And occasionally they'll say something and I'll go, oh, okay, good. That's a good reason why it's a candidate. And other times they'll say things and I'll say, I don't think that really does anything for you, so I really wouldn't be considering that move. And I also have a saying called, you can't play what you don't see, which applies to candidate moves. If you don't consider a candidate move or you don't put it on your candidate list, then you certainly can't analyze it and you can't play it. So if you can't play what you don't see, so if you don't see a move as a candidate move, then obviously you can't play it no matter how good it is. So I picked out a random position from like a student game here, and I thought we'd talk about it a little bit, and I could pick out another position maybe from later in the game. All right, and I have this idea of initial and final candidate moves. What's an initial candidate move? An initial candidate move is one that meets the criteria we just talked about. It does something. It improves your position, not improves your position, but it makes your pieces coordinate better or whatever. It gets pieces into the game. It restricts something your opponent's trying to do. It initiates a tactic. It counters a tactic. Something like that. That's an initial candidate move. A final candidate move is an initial candidate move that passes a couple of criteria. One of the criteria is it's either safe or you're a willing sacrifice, meaning either the move is safe and it doesn't lose anything, or if it does lose something, you're willing to lose it for whatever thing that you're trying to achieve, which would be a sacrifice. The second thing that makes something a final candidate move is that you haven't eliminated it as being not clearly better than another move. In other words, you have some moves that are left and you say, well, A, B, and C are clearly better than D and F, so I can eliminate D, E, and F, and I'm really going to concentrate on A, B, and C. Those would be your final candidate moves. Even if D, E, and F were safe, then A, B, and C are the final candidate moves, the one that you're seriously considering playing after you identify them. So let's take a look at this position. Black has just played bishop to C5. And one of the things you're asking when your opponent makes a move is that move safe? And what are all the things that move does? Well, it's not 100% clear right away that move is safe. But one of the things that it does is it threatens bishop takes F2 check, winning the F pawn and winning the exchange, because after the king would move, the bishop could take on E1 and get the rook for the bishop. So bishop to C5 creates a threat on F2. Now, one way to determine what the candidate moves here would be to start by saying, what are all the moves that make F2 safe? All right, well, moving the king away may stop him from forking the king and the rook, but moving the king still allows him to take the pawn, which may or may not be good for him, but it doesn't make the pawn safe. So moving the king doesn't work. So as fast as possible, you might want to list all the moves that might make F2 safe, and those would be something like bishop E3, bishop G3, queen to E2, rook to E2, and rook to F1. So those would become at least initial candidate moves that would have a chance to make it safe. Now, what else could white do? Well, it's white's turn. He doesn't have to play defense. He could play offense. So we have to look at our checks, captures, and threats. Well, we have a check, knight G5 check. he could take the knight with the pawn, and at first glance it doesn't look like that does very much. But at least we have to look at it, because maybe that sacrifice would really do something. Maybe opening up his king would be worthwhile. Doesn't look like it, but we have to at least make it an initial candidate so that we can look at it. Knight g5 check. My other check is e6 check, forking the king and the bishop. Well, that's a much more interesting move, because I'm willing to give up the exchange if I can win a piece. But of course, after e6 check, he can play bishop takes e6, which theoretically would, or at least superficially, would win a pawn, but then maybe there's some exchange sacrifice possibilities. So e6 check is really a stronger candidate move than knight g5 check. What else could white do? Well, if he ignores f2, what else could he do? Well, he could counterattack on d5 by moving the knight on d2 and threatening queen takes d5 check. At first glance, that doesn't look like it's worth it, because we're not getting enough for our f2 pawn, but it's an idea we have to at least consider. We could play knight e4. Knight e4 looks like it's not safe, because he can just play d takes e4. But knight e4 actually has something to it, because on knight e4, if you just stop and don't make a quiescence error and say, on knight e4, he'll take the knight, I can't do it. But if you look a half move further, after d takes e4, you have queen takes d7 check, which hits the king and hits the rook. And the rook's not guarded, so the king can't go to the back rank. He might have to put a knight or a bishop in the way. And that actually makes a lot of sense. So if you didn't see that, you can't play what you don't see. Knight e4 might be a very reasonable candidate move here. So that's an idea that we have to take into account. We could also sacrifice the exchange on c5 with rook takes c5. Then we could play a move like e6 check or knight e4 after that to follow up. And that could be a combination. By pulling the queen to the c5 square and then playing knight e4, maybe we can get the queen to do something that he doesn't like to do. Maybe then we could play knight to d6 check and fork the king and the rook. In fact, let's look at that. Rook takes c5, queen takes c5, knight e4. If he plays d takes e4, then white has queen takes d7 check, and now black has to play queen e7, or black has to play knight e7. They're both a little bit complicated, because now white has moves like e6 check, which get pretty tight, because again the king can't move because the rook would be hanging. But if the knight goes to e7, the rook's not hanging, because if the queen on d7 takes the rook on c8, the knight on e7 would not be pinned anymore, and the knight could take it. So I'm looking at a line like rook takes c5, queen takes c5, knight e4, d takes e4, queen takes d7 check, knight e7, and not only does the knight on e7 guard the rook on c8, but so does the queen on c5. So that means if white plays e6 check in that position, black could put the rook just back on the back rank, and he's probably okay. So we're seeing some cutesy things here. Let's look at the knight e4 right away. Knight e4 right away. If black plays bishop takes f2 check, then of course knight takes f2. So, and we're hitting the bishop twice. If the bishop moves to b4, then queen takes d5 check. Probably is winning for white. Although bishop to e6 makes it a little complicated, because then he's hitting the queen and he's hitting the rook on e1. Anyway, knight e4, let's say he takes it, d takes e4, queen takes d7 check. Which one could go in the way, the bishop or the knight? Let's put the, I don't know, let's leave the bishop there to threaten f2. Let's put the knight in the way. All right, so we're looking at knight e4, d takes e4, queen takes d7 check, knight e7. Now, as we said, if we play e6 check and the king goes back to g8, we can't play queen takes c8 because the knight would take it. If you don't see what I'm looking at, I'll move the pieces on the board to show you. People are always saying, why don't you move the pieces on the board? Well, you don't learn to visualize better by moving the pieces. You learn to visualize better by practicing visualization. Knight here, pawn takes, queen takes, knight in the way to guard the rook. If pawn checks, king can go back, and now queen takes c8 doesn't work because the knight's guarding it. Could black have just taken that pawn with the queen instead of moving the king? Yep, we'd have to look at that too. Maybe then white would have queen takes, king takes, rook takes, check with some play. We'd have to look at that. The material would be even at that point, so white's not risking a lot by doing that. So knight e4 is a strong candidate move. All right, what else could white play? Let's look at the e6 check move. E6 check is right now my final candidates would be something like rook e2 to guard f2, queen e2 to guard f2. I don't like bishop e3 because he could probably trade it off and then maybe take the pawn on e5. Well, maybe not. Maybe that pawn would be guarded by the rook. I'm looking at bishop e3, bishop takes e3, rook takes e3, f takes e5. On first glance, it doesn't look like white's getting anything special out of that. Queen e2, rook e2 are final candidates. Knight e4 is a candidate. Rook takes c5, e6 check. I'm kind of eliminating knight g5 check. Not a final candidate. Bishop g3 looks a little passive. I'd rather do something a little more active. Bishop g3 isn't terrible. I'm not sure it's one of my final candidates. Let's look at e6 check. E6 check, bishop takes e6. Now the problem with that is I don't have any of those knight e4 ideas anymore because the bishop's not hanging on d7 anymore. So knight e4 is no longer an idea after e6. So what is an idea after e6? E6, bishop takes e6. I still can't play knight g5. Don't think it works. Rook takes e6. King takes e6. Queen to somewhere, e2 check. Now he could put the knight in the way, or he could just put the king back on f7. I don't see that white's getting anything for his sacrifices. e6 check, bishop takes e6, rook takes e6, king takes e6. Queen e2 check, king f7. Don't really see it. Okay, well, does it help in any sense to play rook takes c5 first in any of those lines? I don't see that either. Okay, so the purpose of this video isn't to do a 20-minute exercise on this position. It's to talk about initial and final candidate moves. And we had initial candidate moves with moves like knight g5 check and rook takes c5 and e6 check, but we're slowly eliminating some of those. And we're getting down more to the rook e2, queen e2, knight e4 kind of moves, which are more our final candidates. Knight e4 is the most complicated of the moves because after d takes e4, queen takes d7 check, and black puts something in the way, let's say knight e7, black's still threatening bishop takes f2 check, and he's also threatening e takes f3. So let's show you that. Knight here, pawn takes, queen takes, king here. This is all very cute, but now this knight is in trouble, and this pawn is in trouble, and if white doesn't have anything, that's really good in this position, then he might be in trouble. And we already said, I guess he could play rook takes here, but then when he plays bishop takes f2 check, this rook is only guarded by the bishop on f4, so this gets a little complicated. It's not clear what's going on here. By the way, this is one of those positions you have to watch out a little bit. If we didn't have a knight here and we played king h1, he might have something like, rook takes. If we had to take with the king, he could take back with the play rook h8 check. But our bishop and our knight prevent that kind of stuff, so I'm not too worried. So black here, white could go in the corner. And if black plays rook takes, bishop takes, I think white's okay. Whoops, want to take that back. Take those moves back. I'm just trying to show you some of the possibilities here. So this is all very interesting. It would take me a long time to decide that knight e4 is my best move here. I'm not convinced that it is, but it's certainly a strong candidate. Should we turn on the engine and see what the engine's top 3 moves are and what's the evaluation? Let's do that. Mr. Stockfish, what you got here? Stockfish says the best move is knight to c4. Okay, so you can't play what you don't see. I saw knight e4 because knight e4 is the same trick where he can't take, and you're threatening the bishop on d7. I didn't look at knight c4 as much because knight c4 doesn't stop bishop takes f2 check, but it does hit the queen, which causes some problems. So I should have looked at that move, and the engine says knight c4 is the winning move. So you can't play what you don't see. I saw the idea with knight e4, which is the second best move, and that also wins with +3. The third best move is very surprising. It's e takes f6, just taking the pawn and letting black play bishop takes f2 check. That's not a very human move to play e takes f6, because after bishop takes f2 check, king moves. Black could always play g takes f6 and stop knight g5 check and so on. So that's a little bit beyond my pay grade to see quite why e takes f6 is a final candidate. So my move knight e4 is a final candidate, and it is a winning move, but knight c4, which is a similar move, is actually a lot better. So kudos to you if you said, hey Dan, you found that knight e4 move. How about knight c4? It's sort of the same thing. Maybe it's better, because it is. Okay, initial and final candidates. Let's go a little further in this game. Let's play some moves and see what happened. White guarded the pawn on it with queen e2. Black says, let me pin that e-pawn. White moves the knight out of the way, but now that doesn't do that much because the queen's not attacking d5 anymore. And now that e5 square is getting to be a little bit weak. And now black plays bishop to d6. All right, the engine is off. That's good. Let's scroll here. Bishop d6, trying to add the pressure. Whenever somebody does something like that, the first thing I say to myself is, maybe I can sacrifice my queen and win this game. Because if you play e takes d6 and he plays rook takes e2 and you play rook takes e2, you're already getting a bishop and a rook and getting rid of his bishop pair for the queen. And a bishop and a rook isn't worth a queen, but it's close. And if you get something else for it, maybe you can win. But here, I'm not sure I see that. E takes d6, rook takes e2, rook takes e2. White's not threatening rook e7 check. He's not threatening rook takes c6 followed by rook e7 check. Doesn't look like that works either. So it's very cute, but it's probably not right. What else could white do here? So we're looking for candidate moves. So the first candidate move I look at is e takes d6. I do not eliminate that because I'm losing my queen, because I'm getting a lot for it, but probably not enough. E6 check is again a candidate. Black can obviously just take it with the bishop or the rook, but it is a check. Knight g5 check. Doesn't look like it does anything more than it did before. I could counterattack the pawn on d5 now by moving my queen to the d file. I could play queen to d3 or queen to d2. If he takes the e-pawn, then I can take the d-pawn check, hitting the king and the bishop on d6, which looks promising. But of course, if I move my queen, then... if I move my queen, I'm threatening to take his bishop. Aha! So moving the queen to the d-file, queen d1, queen d2, queen d3, is very possible, because if he stops to save the d-pawn, then I take off his bishop, and if he takes off the e-pawn, I take the d-pawn with check, and maybe I can get something. All right, so let's look at one of those. Let's try queen to d3. If I play queen d3, maybe he has knight to b4, hitting my queen and guarding the pawn on d5. You know, this is where you're avoiding hope chess. You don't want to play queen d3, and then when your opponent plays knight b4, you go, oh, whoops, I missed that. Now he's threatening my e-pawn, and he's threatening my queen, and he's guarding my his d-pawn. If I play queen to d2, he can save his bishop and attack my queen with bishop to b4, skewering the rook and the queen. But after queen to d2, bishop b4, queen takes d5 check, he could play bishop e6, now hitting my queen and hitting my rook on e1. So that's a little bit problematic. That's complicated. That may be still okay for white, but let's try avoiding all that. Let's play queen to d1. I'm doing this by process of elimination. Queen d3, he has knight b4. Queen d2, he has bishop b4. But how about queen d1? queen d1. Now, let's say he plays bishop b4 anyway to save the bishop. If he takes the pawn on e5, then queen takes d5 check hits the bishop. He would have to play rook e6, and then depending on how he took the pawn, he may get into some trouble there. Queen d1, bishop to b4, queen takes d5 check. So queen to d1 is definitely a final candidate. I'm sure there's other possibilities here. Queen d1, bishop b4 to save the bishop. Queen takes d5 check. Not necessary. I don't have to do that. I could have played another move. Bishop to e6. Hits the queen, hits the rook on e1. Similar to the queen d2 line now. Transposing. Alright, queen d1, bishop b4, queen d5 check, bishop e6. Knight g5 check still doesn't work. Queen d7, no good. Queen takes e6, no good. Move the queen to a random square and he just takes the rook. I don't see it. Rook takes c6 or something. No, doesn't do anything. Alright, so I'm starting to think if queen d1, bishop to b4, maybe queen takes d5 check's not the right move. Can white play e6 check instead? Then if rook takes e6, white still can't play. Well, yeah, white can play queen takes d5 because bishop e6 is not playable. And if bishop takes e1, queen takes d7 check maybe. All right, so queen d1, bishop b4, e6 check. We just said taking with a rook is problematic. Maybe he could just take with the bishop. All right, so queen d1, bishop b4, e6 check. Bishop takes e6. I could play rook takes e6. And then queen takes d5. Gets complicated. He could play rook takes e6 in response to rook takes e6. Queen takes d5. Pinning the rook. White has some compensation. Not clear that enough. Let's go back to the initial position. He's got the e-pawn attacked 4 times. White's got it guarded 4 times, but the problem is white's queen is in front of the rook, which means white can't keep recapturing because the counting sequence doesn't work. Because if white does nothing, let's say white plays h3 and black plays f takes e5 and white plays knight takes e5 and black plays knight takes e5 and white plays knight takes e5 and black plays like rook takes e5, white can't play queen takes e5 because he gets a rook and a bishop for his queen, even, not to mention his rook on c1 would be hanging at the end. But he could always trade rook takes c8 at some point. But that's besides the point. The fact is that the queen is in front of the rook means the counting is bad for white. If white plays queen to d1 and black plays bishop to b4, that doesn't help us because if we save the rook, then black can still take the pawn, although black has one less piece on the pawn now without the bishop on it. So queen d1, bishop b4, rook e2. If now f takes e5, knight takes e5, knight takes e5, bishop takes e5, and the bishop is safe because the black bishop on b4 is not attacking e5 anymore. That probably doesn't seem right, though. Let's see if we can do something more forcing. So we're looking for initial candidate moves. We already saw queen to the d file are candidate moves. e6 check is a candidate move. Knight g5 is a candidate move. Does it do any good to play rook takes c6 here to remove the knight from guarding some of those squares? I don't see it. Rook takes c6 does not help us play e6 check. Knight to g5, he just takes the knight with the pawn. We could take the bishop, but he still takes our queen. I'd love to be able to do something more powerful with the queen so that we're threatening to take the bishop. How about queen to b2, guarding the pawn from a diagonal? Instead of hitting the d pawn, I'm just guarding the e pawn. And maybe I'm threatening to well, I'm threatening to take the bishop. If he plays f takes e5, I can probably play knight takes e5. If he plays knight takes e5, I can play rook takes c8. When he captures on c8, then I could capture on e5. I think that's safe. Also on queen to b2, f takes e5, I now have knight g5 check, but I don't have any threats of e6 on top of that, so it's not clear what that's doing. Let's go back and look at queen d3 again. Queen d3, we didn't like moves like bishop b4 and knight b4. Queen d3, knight b4. Do I have any in-between moves with my queen? Queen takes g6 doesn't seem to do anything. Don't like it. All right, so I'm still looking for final candidates. Queen to b2 is a candidate. Queen to d1 is a candidate. Taking that bishop, e takes f d6, rook takes e2, rook takes e2. Looks like white can have some fun there, but I don't think that's quite sound. It's interesting. In a speed game, you could play a move like that and see what you can do with it. In a slow game, you really have to find some compensation, and that pawn on d6 is really good. The rook on the e file is really good. His king is probably okay now. His d-pawn's probably okay once my queen's off the board. I don't know. E takes d6 just doesn't... It's one of those moves you love to play, and if it's a speed game, you just play it and have some fun and see what happens. But I don't see it. So queen b2, queen d1. Do I have any other moves? I could play rook on c to d1 to hit the d-pawn. I guess that's a move. Bishop to e3 to hit the queen, get out of the pin, and then hit the bishop. Ooh, that looks like a candidate move. All right, Dan, you can play what you can't see. All right, bishop to e3. He can't just save the queen because I take this bishop because the pawn on e5 is no longer pinned to the queen. He can't put the bishop in the way because I take it with my bishop and I win a piece, or take it with, probably even take it with the rook. He can't take the e-pawn with the rook for two reasons. One, if bishop e3, rook e5, I have knight takes e5 check followed by bishop takes b6. Or if I didn't see that, I could just play bishop takes b6, rook takes e2, and I win the exchange. But it's better to play knight takes c5 check and win the house. All right, so on bishop e3, can he push his pawn to e3, d4? That's the only move he's got left. Well, I could play... Looks like I'm winning at least a pawn there. If I play e takes d6, d takes e3, and then maybe just knight takes e3, winning a pawn. And I might have better than that. Bishop e3, d4. As I said, I have queen c4 check, but then he has bishop e6, which is complicated. I don't think I really want to look at that unless I have to. By the way, I'm not trying to prove that how good bishop e3 is. I'm just trying to prove that bishop e3 is better than all the other moves. So far, I think it is, because I'm hitting the queen and I'm hitting the bishop. He has to play d4, and at that point, I get a bishop for nothing, and he doesn't get my bishop for nothing. He has to give up a key pawn for it. So I'm starting to think that bishop e3 is the clearly best move in the position. Took me a while to find it, but that's why you play slow chess slowly, because you're looking around for ideas, and bishop e3 is a super final candidate move. All right, I'm gonna guess that bishop e3 is the move. Let's turn on the engine and we'll call it a day. Engine says, you're right, Dan. That's the one and only winning move. After bishop e3, he has to play d4, and white would be winning. Let's see what white played in the game. White played queen to d2, hitting the d-pawn like we said. Bishop to e3. Took me a while, but eventually we got it. All right, tell your friends about the channel. It's the best thing we can do. If you like the video, you can like it. You can subscribe to the channel. I've got over 6,000 subscribers, I think now, around that number. And the The best thing to do, though, is tell your chess friends about the channel. Hopefully you enjoyed today's video about finding candidate moves, and we'll see you next time. Thanks. Bye.